All right, guys. In this moment, what we're going to do is we are actually going to dismiss our kiddos. So today we've got Linda and Victor. Is that right? Linda and Victor? There's Linda and Victor. They have preschool today. So preschoolers, if you want to head that way. And then teaching our elementary school is the fearless Taylor and Nicholas. Right there. So Taylor and Nicholas, you guys are going to go out this door. Preschool is going to go out that door. And while they are getting dismissed, if you are in a little configuration that is less than 3 people, you've got to move to another configuration with more people. And while you do that, go ahead and introduce yourself to them. So you've got to consolidate. You got to move to one with more people. Configure. All right, we have a question to get you started today. And the question is this, after you introduce yourselves to each other. The first question is, would you rather have a gnat in your eye or a hair in your mouth? Go. A gnat in your eye or a hair in your mouth? Go ahead. You're going to have your conversation in Portuguese now. All right, go ahead and we're going to bring it back together, whole group. I want to address the elephant in the room, which is the seating arrangement. For those of you who are new to Clarksburg, you've never been here before, or you haven't come very many times, you may not be familiar, but once in a while we do a seating arrangement like this because I like that you get to hear each other's stories and not just mine. And so what we're going to be doing over the next little bit of time is I'll talk a bit, and then I'll give you a question, and you'll talk a bit, and then I'll talk a bit, and then you'll talk a little bit, and we'll go back and forth like that. Now, please know that you do not have to share anything you are not comfortable sharing. This is supposed to be like a fun, safe space, a space where you can get to know other people, that you can engage with each other. This is not supposed to be like a super awkward time, right? So everybody feels like family, everybody feels comfortable, we're good? Yeah, we're so good. Okay. Also, the other thing I want to let you know about is yesterday we had Clarksburg's second swap, and we did it out on the lawn, and it was phenomenal. It was so much fun. Thank you for those of you who donated items, who also helped set up and tear down. I had at least 3, there were probably more people from the community that came to the swap than like our church people, which is what we want. That's awesome. And then I had people coming up and they're like, well, how much for this item? And I'd be like, oh, no, it's free. And they were like, no. What are you talking about? It's free. And we're like, no, this is what our church does. We live with generosity. We give. We grow in the grace of giving more and more every day. And so we're just giving this stuff away. So take what you want. And they were like, oh my gosh, one lady was like, every church should be doing this. And I was like, well, I don't know. That's what we're called to do. We are just giving stuff away. So it was really, really awesome. It was really cool to see people just drive by, make U-turns, show up in the parking lot, and find a great deal. I found some really cool shoes, thanks to Jill. And so it was a great time, and we'll probably do another swap in a couple months whenever somebody says, hey, we need another swap. I got a ton of stuff in my house. And I'll say, great. And then we'll do another one, and hopefully more and more people, both in the walls of our church and outside the walls of our church, can join in and participate in that. Another thing that I wanted to cover before we jump into our series today is actually so at Clarksburg Church, if you have been here for a while, we don't really talk a lot about finances. We don't really talk a lot about how Clarksburg's budget or anything like that. When we talk about money, it's normally in the context of being generous, growing in the grace of giving. We talk about generosity every day at the end of every week at the end of our service, but we don't try to manipulate people into giving. We don't say, give me your W-2 so I can tell you how much you're supposed to give. We don't do any of those things, but we are trying to become a church that is developing its ability to be self-sufficient and to be self-supportive, and to develop a congregation that grows in the grace of giving so we can continue to build the kingdom more and more and more and more. And so today we're just going to take a brief moment to just talk about where we are financially, what this looks like. So Clarksburg Church has a $300,000 operational budget. And when I first got here last year, that was part of my job to figure out what is the operational budget for Clarksburg Church. So I worked with Rod, I worked with some of the other pastors who were here before I was to kind of see, okay, what do we need? What are our expenses? What does that look like? And so that is our operational budget for the year. That covers everything from our mortgage to paying down our loan. It covers any repairs that have to happen in the building. So like we have 3 buildings on property, so if one of them's filled with mold, it covers the cost of repairing that. If one of the septic tanks explodes, it covers the cost of that. If there's a significant leak in another building, it covers the cost of all of those different things. So that has happened in each of the buildings that we've had this year. So it's covered all of those costs. It keeps the utility lights on, all of those things. But in addition to that, it helps us build the kingdom. So what we do here on Sunday morning, it helps us do that. So we are able to supply curriculum for our children's ministry, great curriculum. We're able to present the gospel to them 52 times a year, plus whatever doesn't happen on Sunday morning. We're able to do really great, cool production stuff. We're able to engage our neighbors in creative events, as well as helping pay rent or utilities for people in the community who need just a little bit of help. It also enables us to train and appreciate and recognize our volunteers, those people who serve in the congregation. So our operational budget covers all of those things. So that's $300,000. So how does that get funded? So the first part of that gets funded. $100,000 of that gets funded by a grant from Fairfax. Now, Fairfax they're our launching church. They have been extremely generous with us. When they merged with this building, my understanding was that there was a lot of renovations and work that needed to be done, and they paid for all of that to happen. In the first year, they covered a huge amount of the operational budget. But just like any good parent who wants to see their child launch and be a successful adult, there comes a time when they start to taper how they support their child. Now, if that support comes away too quickly, it could be detrimental to that child. But if it comes away too slowly, it could also stunt that child's growth. And so this year, we received $100,000 from Fairfax. Last year, we received more than that. Next year, we will receive less than that. So there's this slow tapering of how much Fairfax is going to be helping us and supporting us. Now, that leaves $200,000 for Clarksburg to be raising on their own, to be giving on their own, to support itself. And so far this year, because of your generosity, we have given we've been totally funded, including Fairfax's gift, but what we have contributed has been $104,000, $514.50. Numbers is really just not my thing. So far, we have collected that much. It's because of your generosity that we've been able to give that. It's your generosity that we've been able to fund that. I mean, that has been amazing. And really to think that a church this size has a vision of what God is trying to do in this community so big that we would be that generous is incredible. And so I want to thank you for that. Now, heading into the next few months until the end of the year, we have $95,485.50 left to generate in order to meet our projected goal, our projected expenses that we have for the end of the year. And so I want to let you know where we are. That is going to be a tremendous challenge to make up for in the last 4 months what we've did in the last 8. So if you are in this moment feel called to give, please give. If you already give, thank you so much. If you have more to give, then great. But the thing is that I'm not giving you this information to try to manipulate you to give. Instead, I want you to know where we are in the process of becoming fully sustainable church, a church that is 100% funded by our people, which means we are 100% bought in and invested in this vision and what we're going after. I really, really, really am praying and confident that it is your generosity that will get us to the place where we can enter 2018 ready to go, ready to walk confidently into these next things that God is calling us to do, the ways that he is calling us to build his kingdom and expand what it is that we're doing and how we're serving our community and how we're proclaiming the name of God. So anyways, if you have any questions about any of that, if you want to talk, whatever. I don't want to just give you ideas. But if you have any questions, if you have any comments, you want to have more of a conversation, feel free to either talk with me after service or during the potluck is fine, or if you want to shoot me an email, I can answer whatever questions that you have about that if you want to talk about that more. Oh, you're going to talk a question now?
Just general that I'm sure everybody would want to know. On the app, when you give to the Fairfax
Yes.
Church, and you specify Clarksburg, is that part of that 104,000?
Yes. Yes, it is. If you give in this offering box, so there's 3 ways to give. The offering box in the back, you can give online or you can give through the app. Any one of those all gets charted to Clarksburg. And the team is super diligent about making sure that we get credit for what we're giving and what we're contributing. So, okay, any other questions? We can talk about that afterwards because I do want to dive in to our series today. I'm really, really excited about it. We have been in a series called The Upside Down. Well, it's not The Upside Down. I call it The Upside Down. It's really upside down. And it's talking about this upside down kingdom that Jesus proclaims. It's talking about Jesus' famous sermon in Matthew 5-7 that's called the Sermon on the Mount. Now, as we enter into the book of Matthew, Jesus again and again proclaims the kingdom of God is here. The kingdom of God is at hand. The kingdom has come. And this was this really bizarre thing because the people at that time were like, no. The kingdom is way in the future. And the only way for the kingdom to come is by God's people being morally good enough, by us living up to a certain standard. And Jesus is like, no way, you're wrong. First, the kingdom of God is here. It's right now. And Jesus was actually the one who inaugurated the kingdom. He was the one who began this whole process of the kingdom coming in all of its fullness. And it hasn't completely come. We're waiting till the end for the whole kingdom to come. But right now, it has already started. And then Jesus says this other thing. He says, in this whole idea that like you being good enough is the thing that will bring the kingdom. No, that's wrong too. Instead, we enter into this kingdom through Jesus Christ, what he has done on the cross. That is how the kingdom comes. That is how we enter into the kingdom. That's how we become citizens of this kingdom. And then Jesus says this other thing in his sermon. He talks about how the citizens of this kingdom would live in a daringly countercultural way. It would be totally flipped, totally upside down. They would be different in the way that they steward their sexuality, different in the way that they engage the world, different in the way that they engage those people who have treated them wrong, different in the way that they deal with anxiety or worry. And so we talked about some of those things. We talked about in week 1 how we as citizens of this upside down kingdom, we are called to be salt and light. We are called to be this preservative agent that when things are breaking down, when things are falling apart, we move towards the brokenness. We preserve it as salt. But then as light, we bring hope into the middle of darkness and chaos, that when everybody else is running around like chickens with their heads cut off, we're saying, no. There is hope in this darkness. And then week 2, we talked about how the citizens of this upside-down kingdom engage with the law differently. That because of what Jesus had done, he has fulfilled the law, both in the way that he lived his whole existence without sinning, and then he died for all of us so that our punishment would be taken the way that we were supposed to fulfill the law through death. We would no longer be held to that because Jesus fulfilled the law. Now, last week, we also talked about worry. We talked about worry and anxiety and how citizens of this upside-down kingdom don't worry. Maybe we still worry a little bit, but that worry has to do with the future and a preoccupation to control and to own the future. But the future is God's territory. We can't own it. We can't control it. It totally belongs to God. And what worry does when we worry about controlling and owning the future is that it robs us from the sacredness of this moment right now, which is really all that we have. It robs us from the sacredness of this, but it also, when we try to control God's territory, when we try to move in on the future and worry about it, the other thing that it does is it keeps us from taking whatever the next faithful step we're supposed to take, which then leads to us being paralyzed to live out what God has called us to in the future. And so God says, no. Jesus says, you don't worry about it. Just trust. Take the next step. And everything else will fall into place because God owns the future. That's God's territory. And so today, we're going to be looking at another way that Christ calls us to live as these citizens of this upside-down kingdom. But first, in your group, I have a question for you to answer. If you've been here for the Upside Down series, which part of the Sermon on the Mount has challenged you the most? Go. All right, we'll go ahead and bring it back up here. Some of you are like, wait, that wasn't 2 minutes. I know, but some people were stopped talking, so I was like, all right, well, move on. Okay, so in week 4, and this week, what we're going to be talking about is how citizens of this upside-down kingdom engage in interpersonal relationships. How do we engage with other people when there's a weakness, or there is a sin, or there is evil that is going on? How do we engage with other people? And now, here at Clarksburg Church, we sat down a couple months ago and we said, okay, what are our themes? What are the things about who we are as a group, who we are as people? What are the stories that run through everything we talk about? And one of the things we said was, we are a welcoming bunch. We like to engage people. We like to run up to them when we see a new face on Sunday morning and we say, oh my gosh, who are you? Where are you from? Tell me all about your life, right? So we like to engage other people. What's that? Not in that voice. Okay, fine, not in that voice. I don't know, sometimes I make that voice. Okay, so we like to engage that. So particularly as we become a community of people that engages well with one another, what happens both when your boss does something wrong to you, when your boss is doing something that is evil, that is wrong, that is flawed, but what happens when someone in the church does something that is wrong to you, that is evil, that is flawed, that is wrong? Well, how do you engage each other? Do we just sit on it and shut our mouths and talk about it in the corner? Do you know what she did? Right? How do we engage one another? How do we do it when we're here? How do we do it when we're there? How do we do it when we're at home? How do we do it? How do we engage when there is someone who has a flaw, who there is an injustice that has happened? What does this look like? And so Jesus, in his Sermon on the Mount, he actually engages this too. So in Matthew chapter 7, verse 1 and 2, he says this. He says, do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. With the measure that you use it will be measured to you. This is what Jesus says. He says, do not judge. Now, this word judge actually has, like all words in English, have this lexicon range, right? It has this range of meanings. It could mean several different things. It couldn't mean anything, but it has kind of this range of things that it means. Now, most of the time, we interpret this word judge in this passage to mean that you don't judge, and to judge, we interpret judge to mean that you can't evaluate or criticize or challenge someone's thoughts, their beliefs, their actions, or their values. You can't go up to somebody and say, you have the wrong values. You can't go up to somebody and say, your action is wrong. That's how we interpret this word, judge. You can't criticize or challenge somebody. And so we, in this society, have this phrase of like, who am I to judge? Like, oh, well, I mean, who am I to judge? Like, you just did something heinously wrong, but who am I to judge? Like, I can't judge you. We say phrases like, don't judge me, right? In that voice, exactly. And we do all sorts of things like that where we're like, you can't judge me, don't judge. In fact, I think it's interesting that people can know nothing about Jesus and have no biblical background, but the one scripture they have memorized is this one: do not judge. And they say, Jesus says, don't judge. You can't judge. It's the most memorized verse in our entire culture. But if we interpret it to mean that you can't challenge somebody for doing something wrong, you can't criticize somebody's thoughts or their behaviors or their actions, we have a little bit of a challenge. There's a problem with interpreting that verse that way. The first challenge that we have is that Jesus in the Bible, in the narratives that we read of what Jesus did and what he said, he walked around all the time judging all sorts of people. He'd looked at the religious leaders and he'd say, you're wrong, don't do that. He'd look at people and say, goats, don't do that anymore. Go away from this moment and never do it again. He judged people throughout the biblical narrative in that way. He challenged people. He challenged the establishment. He challenged powers. He challenged religious leaders in all sorts of ways. So that's a problem with interpreting that passage that way. The second problem we have with interpreting this do not judge passage in that way is that it kind of creates a schizophrenic culture. And here's what I mean by that. To say that you can't judge somebody means that it's the most wrong thing in the world to say somebody else is wrong. But how can you say someone else can't say that they're wrong, because then you would be saying that that person is wrong because you've told them that they're wrong, but you can't actually tell them they're wrong because it's wrong to tell somebody you're wrong. Got it?
That's where I live.
So that is a logical loop that you can never get out of. You can't not judge somebody or tell them that they can't judge, because you would be telling them it's wrong to tell them it's wrong, and you're telling them they're wrong. So you're wrong. Right? We live in this logical loop, and in our culture, that's very much the logical loop that we live in. So at the same time where we hold up this value and say, hey, you can't tell anybody they're wrong, you can't judge people, who am I to judge? We also have this other part of our culture that when someone doesn't stand up for certain things, they're criticized and said, well, you should have stood up against that moral behavior. You should have stood up against that moral thinking. You should have said no to that. And so then it's kind of, we live between these things of like moral cowardice where we say, well, I can't tell anybody they're wrong. And this place of sanctimonious expression where we say like, no, you need to come down on these wrong things. You need to say that this is wrong and that is wrong and this is wrong. So we live in this tension of calm down or blow up. And we constantly try to have to navigate, like, okay, well, is this a time when I'm supposed to, like, not judge and say, who am I to judge, and not say anything? Or is this a time when I'm supposed to stand up against the injustices and evil in this world? Which am I supposed to do when? And so we live in this schizophrenic culture that bounces back and forth between these two things, and it's impossible to figure out how are we supposed to posture ourselves? How are we supposed to respond to sin and evil and wrongdoing and injustice? Are we supposed to be calm and be placid and just roll over and take it? Or are we supposed to blow up and take a stand and fight for justice and protest? Like, what are we supposed to do? Now, we are called as citizens of this upside-down kingdom to challenge evil. We're called to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. We are called to stand up and say, no, that is wrong, to stand up to injustice and stand up to evil, to speak truth to power. We are absolutely supposed to do that. So in this passage, what does judge mean? When Jesus says, do not judge, what he's referring to, the lexiconal range of that word, is not talking about don't criticize or challenge the attitudes or actions. What he's saying is he's talking about what is God's authority to judge. He's saying, do not judge in terms of having the ultimate destruction of evil. Throughout all of the narrative of the Bible, in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, all the stories from beginning to end, there's sort of this overarching narrative where God wants to be with his people, that evil entered the world and God's willing to do anything in order to overcome that evil. So he sends his son Jesus to live this perfect life on the earth, to fulfill the law by living this perfect life, and then to die for us, so us who could not live a perfect life would also have fulfilled the law. And then he died and he rose again. And the whole story over and over and over again is that Jesus is coming back. Jesus is going to return, and when he returns, his kingdom will come in fullness, and God will judge the world. At that time, it will be the end of evil. There will be no more evil or evildoers in this kingdom. This kingdom will be full of God's glory, God's greatness, God's love, and there will be no place for evil. And that is what Jesus is talking about. He's saying, hey, do not judge. Don't think that you are the one who is going to end evil. Don't think that you are the one who is the ultimate one who is going to punish all the evildoers. Do not judge. That is God's territory. That is what God is called to do. He has a plan, and we're moving towards that plan, and we are confident that he is working towards that. He will end evil. We are not the ultimate judge and jury on evil, but we are called to confront it. So how do we confront it? How do we confront evil but not step into God's territory of ultimately deciding the final role of evil and condemning it? How do we confront it without stepping into God's territory? Well, Jesus tells us in Matthew 7, verse 3 through 6, he says this. He says, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take out that speck from your eye, when all the time you have a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly enough to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Do not give dogs what is sacred and throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. So Jesus uses this illustration. He says, you have to remove the plank from your own eye before you get a speck out of somebody else's. Now let's think for a second, how do you remove a speck from somebody else's eye? We had some friends over to our house to eat dinner in our backyard the other night, and the gnats were crazy. And so at one point, there was a gnat that flew into the husband's eye, and his response was, get out. So his wife quickly came over to him and was like, oh, honey, okay, I got it, right? And then it got out of the eye, and we were saved, and it was good. But how do you remove a speck from somebody's eye? If that was, if I had something in my eye and I called out for Zach and I said, hey, I need help, there's something in my eye, and he came at me with a hammer, I'd be like, no, stay away, no, right? If he came at me with tweezers, even that, no way, get those tweezers away from my eye. But if he came at me with a warm compress and he said, lay on the couch and let me dab this warm washcloth over your eye and have it just gently dribble out whatever is clogged in your soft tissue that is your eyeball, right? I'd be like, yes, please, come help me do that. Well, the problem is, a lot of the times, when we go at the idea of taking a speck out of somebody's eye, we don't do it with a warm washcloth. We don't do it right. And the speck in somebody's eye, it limits their vision. It limits their ability to see what is really happening in their life. It limits their ability to know what's going on. And in fact, if it stays there long enough, it can destroy their soul. You see, every single one of us has specks in our eyes, specks in our soul. We have these things, these sins, these fears, these faults, these worries, these addictions that limit our ability to see clearly what God is doing in our lives. And it slowly destroys our soul. It blinds us to what is really going on. And so sometimes one of the things that can happen, I mean, this is my story, and chances are this is somebody else's story in this room too, because I know the world and I know this area, but there could be somebody who, like, they have so many ambitions for work and vocational success that they're going after those things and they think that they're doing it right, but what they're blinded to is the fact that their marriage is falling apart. What they're blinded to is the fact that their kids don't have time to spend with them. Or they think they have an addiction and their blind spot is, no, everything's fine. I'm totally in control of this thing. I can stop whenever I want to. But they're blinded to the fact that they can't, and that their life is changing and their behavior is changing. And who they are is changing. See, we need people to help us in those moments when we are blinded to things. We need speck removers. We need people to come and help us. We need people with moral courage that can come and step up to us and say, hey, you have a speck in your eye. There's a problem here. But the problem with being speck removers is that, one, a lot of times we come at people when trying to remove a speck with a hammer and a screwdriver. I don't know about you, but this is particularly hard for me in my marriage. I see a speck and I'm like, let me get that out of there, right? We go after people with hammers and screwdrivers. We don't go with love. We speak very harshly. And so for the person who has the speck in their eye, it feels like you're trying to trap them. It feels like you're trying to get them, like you're trying to condemn them, that you're trying to put them in their place. And so we struggle with being good speck removers. The other problem is that while we're trying to help other people get the specks out of their eye, we're totally ignoring the fact that there is a plank in our own eye. If we don't have the moral courage to deal with our own sin, we're not going to be able to deal with somebody else's. Now, when Jesus talks about this whole idea of like, oh, there's a speck there and a plank here, the reality, I've always had that visual. Like, you can even see me while I'm talking about it. I keep talking about the plank because there was a skit when I was in middle school about this passage, and the person came out on stage with this huge plank in their eye, and they kept like swinging around, and everyone had to duck and this whole thing. So that's how I always visualize this passage. But the reality is Jesus is not talking about that person's sin being a very tiny sin and your sin being a super big sin. He's not talking about the different sizes of sin or the different scale of sin. What Jesus is talking about is perspective. If you have a speck in your own eye, it looks like a plank because it covers so much of your eye. It covers so much of your vision. And so you can't go after somebody to help somebody. You can't help somebody else remove that speck because it is dangerous because you actually can't see yourself. You need to focus on your own first before you can address somebody else's. But culture tells us the complete opposite. We actually see other people's sins as these huge planks, as these huge logs, and we see our own sin as these tiny little specks. We use this phrase, we say, well, I'm not perfect. And what that really means is like, yeah, but my sin is really tiny. Like, you have big sin, but mine, I'm not perfect. Mine's little, right? And so we say this phrase, and we're really just trying to say that we don't have a lot. And so we look at the rest of the world, and we say, oh, culture sins, huge. My spouse's sins, huge. My boss's sins, huge. Coworker sin, huge. But I'm not perfect. I have a little bit, right? We say these things, and we live in a culture that constantly makes other people's sins huge and our own very little, which is the exact opposite of what Jesus is trying to get us to pay attention to. We live our lives as speck removers and plank ignorers. You can see this in the news media all the time, right? 24 hours a day, they are displaying this news that basically covers other people's sins. Well, on the news today, this person said that. At 5 o'clock, this person did that, right? They're really good, juicy, evil-doing sins, right, that they highlight. And we all tune in and we watch them and we're like, yes. But no forecaster, no news anchor person sits there and says, and do you know what I did last night? You know what I'm really struggling with? Now, that's not a critique of them because that's not their job, right? But we harp on this whole idea of pointing out other people's sins and inflating them and making them huge. We do this in our interpersonal relationships, and we also do this on social media. When was the last time you saw somebody post, hey, I sinned today, and what I did was... No, I mean, you go on that Clarksburg Village Facebook page, and it is, somebody cut me off on the circle next to Harris Teeter. If you see this license plate, you key their car, right? That's the kind of, I mean, we love to point out other people's sins. We love to make those sins super big, and we view our own as so small. And the reason for this is because it's easier to talk about other people's hate than to talk about our own hate. It's easier to talk about other people's prejudice than to talk about our own prejudice. It's easier to talk about how somebody's not socializing with other people than it is to look at our own table and who's sitting around it, and our own social calendar and who's sitting around it. And that ultimately, we invite people that look just like us to our table. We invite people who act just like us or think just like us to our table. We invite people who have the same education level to our table, so we can keep up with the same conversation. It's easier to talk about the greed of Wall Street than it is to talk about our own greed. It's easier to talk about somebody else's financial inconsistencies than it is to talk about our own ways that we are poorly stewarding God's resources for us. But what Jesus is saying is you have got to get in touch with your own plank. You've got to own your own plank before you can address somebody else's. It doesn't mean that we're supposed to ignore somebody else's plank. It just means that if once we address our own, then the harshness in which we approach them is gone. Once we deal with our own sins, our own faults, it's not that then we avoid somebody else's, it's that we can approach them without being super sanctimonious and holier than thou. But how do we go up to somebody? How do we go up to somebody and say, hey, I think there's a speck, without them running in the other direction? How do we go up to somebody and say, hey, I want to help you see this thing that's going on in your life, without them being defensive, without them shutting you down, without them getting mad or angry? How do we do that? Well, Jesus says in Luke chapter 6, verse 27 and 28, he says, but you who are listening, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. This is what Jesus says we are supposed to do. This is how we engage those who have the specks in their eye. We do it with love, but we don't love so that evil can flourish. We don't love so that they can continue in their evil ways and they can get away with things. We love them so that they would be transformed by love. We love them in these radical ways so that they would no longer be enemies. They would no longer be our enemies. See, being quiet and clamming up and just saying, no, who am I to judge? I can't say anything, doesn't change the world. It doesn't change culture. But neither does rioting and violence. That doesn't change culture either. What changes culture is the gospel. What changes culture is the love that Jesus had for us when he died on the cross and he sacrificed himself for all of us. That is the thing that changes culture. And so Colossians 1:21 through 22 says this. It says, once you were alienated from God. And that's talking, Paul in this passage is talking to a group of Christians. So it's like he's talking to us here in this room. Once you, Beth, once you, Anna, once you, Megan, once you, Dave, once you, Charlotte, once you were alienated from God, and you were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. You were enemies. We were enemies of God. But now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish, and free from accusation. We were all enemies of God. And Jesus didn't die for us so that we could keep being enemies. Jesus didn't die for us so that we could keep flourishing in our sin and our evilness and our injustice. Jesus died for us so that we would be transformed by his love. And followers of Jesus for centuries have followed in Jesus' footsteps of laying down their life, laying down their love, sacrificially loving other people so that they could be transformed. Now I'm going to hand it off to your groups again, and after you're done with this question, we'll wrap it up in just a second. But in your groups, I want you to talk about this question. I want you to share a time that you have been transformed by the love of another. Share about a time that you have been transformed by the love of another. All right, go ahead. All right. So you probably remember this story. On June 17th, in 2015, there was a man named Dylan Roof who walked into an AME church in Charleston, South Carolina. And he walked into this church and he began shooting. As a result of this shooting, there were 9 people that lost their lives. Now, months later, when Dylan Roof, who had been arrested and was in his hearing for his bail hearing, all of the family members of those 9 victims showed up at the bail hearing. And they were given an opportunity to speak, to say something to the one who had taken the people that they loved. One of the women who died, her name was Ethel Lance. Her daughter was there that day. Her name was Nadine Coyer. And they stood there with this opportunity to say something to the person who had done such evil, had performed such an injustice. And what flowed from the mouths of the families of the victims was something that no one expected. It was something that they hadn't talked about first. They hadn't rehearsed it. They hadn't planned, hey, this is what we're going to say. Instead, it was something that just flowed from the lives of these individuals who had been transformed by the love of Christ, that had been transformed by this God who had sent his one and only Son to this earth so that we could be with him. So Nadine Coyer was the first one who stepped up. And again, having been transformed by the love of Christ, she steps up and she looks at her perpetrator in the eyes. And she confronts evil. She doesn't avoid it at all. She confronts evil and she looks at him and she says, I forgive you. I will never hold my mother again because of what you did. But if God forgives you, I forgive you. And then she steps down, and one by one, every family member of the individuals who had been killed stepped up and repeated the same thing. I forgive you, I forgive you, I forgive you. In that moment, they do this incredible upside down kingdom thing. They do this thing that nobody can explain. It's inside out. It's contrary to culture. It doesn't make any sense. And yet they stand up and they look at evil and they say, I forgive you. And I promise you, it's not possible that came out of some naivety that said, hey, if we say this thing, then this person is going to become a Christian, and then everything's going to be better. In fact, Ruth's story doesn't at all say, it hasn't yet turned out that he's had a heart change, that somehow that evil has been conquered by love. And yet that group of people, those family members, knew that the only way to overcome evil is not with more evil. The only way to overcome evil is not with violence. The only way to overcome evil is with love. And so having been transformed by the love of their Savior, they were enabled, they were empowered as citizens of this upside-down kingdom to stand up there and say, I forgive you. Now, we're going to have the band come up, and we're going to sing 2 songs together, but the first one, it talks about God calling us to the altar. God calling us to a place of forgiveness, God calling us to a place of transformation. And so what I wanted to do this morning is I actually wanted to create this area right here, these steps in front of this stage, that this would be our altar this morning. And that if in the course of what we're talking about today, you felt like, gosh, I need to be transformed by that love. Maybe for the first time, I need to be transformed by Christ's love. I want to invite you to come to the altar. I want to invite you to come as a symbol of saying, God, I need your love. I need to be transformed by who you are. And maybe for others of you, you have been transformed by Christ's love, but you recognize that there is a speck in your own eye and you need somebody to help you get it out. Would you come to the altar to cry out to God for help? Or maybe for others of you, you have been going after somebody else's speck, and you haven't yet confronted your own. Or you've been going after them with a hammer and a screwdriver because you are just so frustrated. And you need God to give you some warm water. You need him to give you some love in order to go after that person with compassion, to deal with your own sin. So when you help somebody else, it's not so harsh. If for any of those reasons you would like to come to the altar, I invite you to come up this morning. Would you stand with us as we worship God?